Danny, thank you so much for doing this. It was just, we were just delighted to, we actually scheduled a vacation and then started calling bookstores along the way and say, hey, could we stop in and are you interested in us, doing an event? And Danny just immediately said yes. And we're just so grateful for that. Thank you. And I'm really grateful that Calrose was able to make the time here. So Calrose just got back from 3 weeks in Australia, 5 weeks in Australia, just got back 2 nights ago. And so if she starts to nod off, I'll, I'll poke her. And so she's dealing with a little bit of jet lag here, but I'm so grateful that you're here. So Calrose and I have been working together for about 12 years. And I just want to brag on her a little bit. Calrose was one of the principals involved in this really sort of game-changing initiative called the Marin Carbon Project. And I don't know if any of you have, I see some heads nodding. This was, it was large in scope, but small, or I should say small and direct in scope, but large in implementation. They were really interested in trying to understand what the role that compost could have in regenerating soil, improving soil, and really having an impact on the climate. And it's had far-reaching implications. And Calrose went from there to work at throughout many different levels in California government, leading to some tremendous policy changes that have occurred there and then have extended to a number of states around the West and other parts of the country and to federal policy. And I can't believe, every time I talk to you, I can't believe all the different wonderful things you're working on. So thank you for all your good work.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, but we're here to talk about you. So that's what we're going to do. Mark, for those of you who don't know, describes himself as a greenhouse gas accountant, which I don't know about you, but it sounds really boring to me. So we're going to ask him a couple questions about what that is. And the first one really is, can you just talk to us about what a greenhouse gas accountant does and what you do specifically in your role in that capacity?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that. So the science of greenhouse gas accounting really started in 1992 when the countries of the world signed what's called the Earth Summit. The wonky term was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but it was the Earth Summit, and that's where the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, really was born out of that step. And what the countries of the world decided at that time was they were concerned about global warming. It was not, at the time it wasn't a crisis like it's becoming now, but there was a lot of concern. They wanted to know what the total greenhouse gas emissions were that were being generated by human activities. And more importantly, what could be done about it, where they were coming from, and what could be done about it. And so that spawned these initiatives to do what we called greenhouse gas inventories, which is essentially to add up what the total greenhouse gas emissions from human activities were by the different countries of the world. And I worked in a research team at Colorado State University for 25 years that focused on trying to add up the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And at the time, when the treaty was signed, we'd only known for maybe a decade that methane was even a greenhouse gas. There was not that much known about it, where it came from, and what could be done about it. Similar with nitrous oxide, another really important greenhouse gas. And that just speaks to, it was a very, very daunting and heroic task that certain members of the IPCC, including the people who led our research team, then undertook in the next 5 years to develop a way to inventory the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And so they were like the chefs writing the cookbooks, and I was like the test chef in the back kitchen who was taking the recipes and then trying to figure out, okay, how do we make this dish? does this work? And finding out, oh, well, we can't get saffron here. So speaking to, we couldn't get certain types of data that they wanted to actually drive the models. Or we found that there were, so I was basically the one testing the recipes and providing feedback to the chefs, and then going out into the world and actually cooking the dishes, working with farmers and ranchers on many, all the continents around the world except for Antarctica. I worked in all those places with other colleagues around the world and other people from CSU actually doing these greenhouse gas inventories. So that's basically what our work has been.
It's pot calling the kettle black because I did inventories for 9 years. So, but it's detailed work to say the least. So I'm going to shift to a softer question because you are a greenhouse gas accountant, but you're not just a greenhouse gas accountant. And something that really struck me when we had dinner the other night was you talking about how, you sat down to write this book and you wrote a certain number of pages, quite a few, I think. And then you were like, no one's going to read this. Like, this is just like a textbook. And how you thought about poetry. And so, in reading this book, which I hope you all get a chance to do, something that I was worried about was like, oh gosh, it's going to be a thing. I'm going to have to sit down and like really read it. And no, how I've read it is I've picked up and read a chapter here. I've picked up and read a chapter there. I've picked it up and read a couple pages and then flipped forward and read a couple more. And I was hoping you could just start us off by explaining briefly your inspiration and reading the poem at the start of this book, because I think it's a beautiful way to kick off an exploration into this beautiful, not boring text that you have written.
Thank you, Keller Rose. I did write about 50,000 words, and I could barely read it myself. So I realized nobody else is going to want to read this. And around that time, I read this wonderful book by Ted Kooser. Any Ted Kooser fans here? He's a poet. Yeah, poet laureate of the U.S. For several years, and he's from Nebraska, where I'm from. Anyway, he wrote this wonderful book called The Poetry Home Repair Manual, and it's about how to write poetry. And I read the book, and then I had this inspiration, well, maybe I'll go back and reread it, and wherever I come across the word poem, I'll exchange the word for essay and see if it still works, and it could help inform me in trying to write this book. And that's what I did. And it was tremendously helpful. And in particular, one metaphor Ted has in there that played a role for me was, he said, writing a poem or writing an essay is like looking through a window. And you can stand in front of the window with the light in such a way so that all you see is the scene in the window. But then if you step aside or the light changes a little bit, you can see a little bit of your own reflection in the glass that's part of the story. And that metaphor in that book sort of gave me permission. I realized what I was really striving for, I realized I needed to include some of my own personal experiences. And that's when writing that textbook became writing a journal of discovery for me. And some of my own encounters, even though I'd been working with these farmers and ranchers around the world and trying to add up and inventory these greenhouse gas emissions from the farm level all the way up to the country level, I realized there still was so much I didn't know about food, and in particular about how the climate crisis was affecting my own feelings about food and how that food was affecting me. I'm a big fan of Barry Lopez. Any Barry Lopez fans here? Yeah, wonderful. I think I may have read everything he's written. I don't know. Maybe there's more out there. But I open with this line of his from a book that was book of essays that was published after he died. It reads, "Is it still possible to face the gathering darkness and say to the physical earth and to all its creatures, including ourselves, fiercely and without embarrassment, I love you, and to embrace fearlessly the burning world?" and that's from an essay titled Embrace Fearlessly the Burning World.
Thank you, Mark. Um, so, one of the things I really love about this book, again, is that it's not about explaining, it doesn't preach. You really take us along for your ride. And I want to have you start off by reading a passage from one of these rides that you went on in a place in Colorado. And just kind of we're going to be brought along into Mark's world on one of these rides to get a taste of where he went. And I would just add, and how he went there.
So it's this one right here, right? Okay.
You want to hold this?
Okay, I can get
Sorry
that.
about this. This is why we need the stand.
So this is near Seabrook, Colorado, which is out near the Kansas border. Arriving for the first time at a farm owned by Curtis Sales and his wife and family. A short time earlier, I had pulled into Curtis's farmyard near Seabrook, Colorado. At the farmyard entrance stood a painted steel sign held between two elegant steel posts, and the perforated letters Kurt and Kelly Sales, and cutouts of a tractor and a combine. Next to it stood a square white sign with America standing out in neat blue capital letters near the top, and in a row underneath read the words, One Nation Under God. Covering the bottom half was a single painted square of a vibrant red and blue bear claw quilt pattern surrounding a painted cross. What struck me about that is I just felt like, having grown up in central Nebraska, I felt like I'd kind of arrived at home, and these were people I knew. It was wonderful.
And would you tell us a little bit about what you found on their farm by reading the passage a couple pages before? One of the things that I love about Mark is how he just approaches reality with what is. And there's not a preconceived notion of these people are, or I am, or they are. It's just he really shows up and takes the place in. So this is a little bit about what he took in on their farm.
So this is Curtis speaking. In the 40 years I've been farming, I've never been more in touch with my farm and my soil as now. Curtis Sales and I were crouched around a shovelful of soil pulled from a research plot near his home. Curtis's son-in-law and farming partner, Pat Einspar, had run into town to replace a hydraulic hose needed to unload a 30-ton load of millet. Curtis says, "We're dead in the water until Pat gets back. Let's go have a look around." The plot where we had taken the sample was part of an experiment Dr. Megan Shapansky from Colorado State University had developed with Curtis and other farmers in the region. The soil in this plot, a deep brown clayey loam named Richfield, had the same qualities I'd seen in other growers' regeneratively managed soil. It held tilth. Plant roots and mycorrhizal fungi ran through the cluster. Insects and worm tracks cut across the shovel profile. Nymphs and grubs fell from the soil clumps as we broke apart the shovelful. It was consistently damp throughout, and it had a lightness to it that I coveted for my own garden.
All right. So, with that beautiful picture in mind, we're going to move into something that I get asked a lot in my line of work, and it's pretty simple. This is the part where I am trying to teach a little bit. I'm sure all of you in the audience know this kind of stuff, but I get this a lot, and it's why is plowing not great? Like why did we do it if it's not good, and why is it quote unquote bad now? And again, Mark doesn't talk about things in a good or bad way. He just talks about what they are.
So just for a little background, this is a chapter about bread, and I'm telling the story about my great-grandmother's farm that she owned in Yuma County, and which she lost in 1935 in a tax sale. I went out and I visited the farm, and I was struck by just the experience of that, and also understanding that my own roots in farming. My parents and grandparents were the first generations off the farm, and how these issues that we're dealing with. Every family has family members that are farming either now or sometime in the past, and have had a role in growing food for us. For a time, plowing the soil created free fertilizer. As the organic matter decomposed, nutrients essential to plant growth and chemically bound to the soil organic matter became free and available. As long as there was organic matter that would decompose, there were free nutrients available to grow crops. Farmers worked the soil before the harvest to prepare seed beds, and again after harvest to kill weeds, leaving the soil exposed for months out of every year. Great Plains winds and rainstorms eroded bare soil, whereas spectacular wheat crops grew in the first years after the plow. The fertility rapidly declined, particularly in Neva's, that's my great-grandmother, particularly in Neva's sandy soil, and the fragile topsoil blew away. Neva's soil probably was completely played out by the time of the 1929 market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression.
Thanks, Mark. That paragraph really struck me as this isn't something new, right? This is something that has come to us over the past century. And I think one of the ways to really understand our role as managers, the farmers and ranchers who are managers of these soils, you describe really beautifully when you talk about how carbon cycles through the soil ecosystem. And I was wondering if you would just read us that passage where you talk about that. I think that's on 51.
So I'm talking about my colleague, Dr. Francesca Catrufo at Colorado State University. And she gave this wonderful presentation to the Land Institute several years ago. This was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and they have an annual meeting. So she went there and she gave this wonderful presentation that is available on YouTube. And if any of you are curious about it, come see me afterwards and I'll give you the name and show you how to search for it. Francesca likens the way soil carbon cycles underground and supports the health of this underground world and the thriving of the plants above it to a savings account and a checking account. As we need to put a deposit in our bank account every month to support our living expenses, plant roots and animal manure are necessary to support the health of the soil community. If inputs into the soil checking account are continuous, strong, and diverse, the microbial legions put aside the byproducts that accumulate in the savings account vault. The beauty of natural systems is that they work as highly efficient production systems. Plants and the animals that graze on them continuously feed the below-ground community, which in turn recycles the nutrients that plants need to grow, all the while setting aside some carbon in the vault. This process maintains the productivity of natural systems while storing carbon in the soil until the vault fills up.
Thanks. So that plowing sort of draws our bank account down too far, and all these other things, right? They fill it back up. So we're going to indulge me here, and maybe if you live on the Western Slope, you feel this also. The grasshopper pressure has been real strong the last couple years. I don't think I've ever tried to kill something as much as I've tried to kill grasshoppers, and I don't support side as a word. Like I'm not supportive of that kind of stuff, but yeah, I really, really grew to hate them in a deep, deep way. So, just as an anecdote, my friend actually made me one of those things that you hit with a piñata of a grasshopper just for like catharsis, and I love him for that. So I was so excited when I came across this little bit in Mark's book about grasshoppers. because the solution that he talks about is actually the solution that I landed on as well. Is the only thing that really worked for me, and I hope is inspirational for folks who live here on the Western Slope and deal with grasshopper pressure. And I think it's a nice segue to really understand it's not about one practice. It's not about the one thing that kills the grasshopper. And Mark's going to talk a little bit about what it is about.
So I got connected with Tony and Barclay Durrani at Indian Ridge Farm in Norwood. Do any of you know them? And I know there's at least one chicken farmer here in the audience they grow pasture-raised poultry, and they use chicken tractors, a method similar to what help me with the name. Yeah, Joel Salatin uses, developed in Virginia, and they've adapted it to use out in this area here. They grow, I think it's about 10,000 chickens a year in their system. It's pretty impressive. And they had, well, anyway, I'll just read here. We've had grasshopper problems in the past, Tony said. Our first year, which was a drought, they were so bad that they seemed to eat every green thing on the farm, added Barclay. We found that our turkeys love grasshoppers, she exclaimed. The turkeys came out here and like an army. They marched through and ate every single grasshopper. We examined the grass in the row as it receded through the succession of days since the most current grazing. You can see the regrowth already, Tony pointed out. New leaves sprang from grass stems, and new stems emerged from the earth. More than chickens, we are growing grass. Barclay and Tony have tightened the food loop by adapting a food system compatible with their ecosystem and selling products into the local economy. Theirs was a clear example of raising livestock in ecosystems too marginal for raising crops, as their experience demonstrated. It is a compelling vision of a diverse food system that, as Tony mentioned to me later, drastically shortens the food miles of the typical plate of North American food.
Thanks. And another problem we have out here, I don't know if any of you all have noticed, white tops is a big issue. I think some folks are even trying to do some genetic work to really address that. But these same farmers that Mark visited, who have their army of turkeys, I rent mine from my neighbor now for a couple weeks in the spring and then later in the summer, and they come over and they eat all the grasshoppers. My HOA won't let me own them, but renting them is fine. So that's how we get around that one. Anyway, I think one of the things we hear a lot about, at least in my line of work, is like, well, what do I do about the weeds? Are the weeds, and how do we do that? And how do we do that without plowing? And I found this example that Mark's going to read us next to be a really compelling example of understanding the way the larger system functions and how weeds function within that. That one is going to be on 287. Yeah, there it is.
Okay, got it. When they first got to Wrights Mesa, Barclay and Tony planted windbreaks around a patch of soil that would grow vegetables, installed high tunnels, which are inexpensive, passively heated greenhouses, to extend the season, and began growing. It was a partial disaster, Tony said. A drought pummeled them the first year, and their field was overrun by whitetop, a highly invasive weed. We learned that we should never have plowed that field, he said. Then they came across the idea of raising chickens and turkeys and read about Joel Salatin's systems for pastured chicken production. They bought some used equipment, restored their plowed field back to the pasture, and began the transition to raising chickens.
Can I just talk a little bit about that
Yeah,
too?
yeah. I think so. I mentioned before that this was a journal of discovery for me, and I've been a meat eater my entire life, and there's a lot of debate there's a lot of discussion about the climate impacts of raising meat and eating meat and dairy products. And one of the things that I was so impressed by um, Barclay and Tony's experience, and so many other growers that I've met with and talked with, growers up in the Elk River Valley, around Steamboat Springs, growers on the Eastern Plains, growers in Wyoming and Montana. It's not as simple as that question of just giving up meat. What we find particularly, and I'm sure you see this here, um, there's a lot of places in the world where it would be a disaster. It would be um, beyond a disaster to try to grow tomatoes and wheat and lettuce. The soils aren't compatible. It's not good for or the climate won't support it. There may not be the irrigation water that's needed. Um, but probably most significantly, it just wouldn't work. The soils would just maybe run away or run off or blow. The most sustainable thing, if we're going to eat locally in those ecosystems, is to raise livestock, do it in a way that's compatible with the soils, compatible with the forage systems. And we see that here in this area. We see that throughout the Intermountain West and in many parts of the East and the Midwest as well too. The other thing that we're finding that I think is so interesting, and this is a relatively new discovery, and it comes out of I think some fascinating farmer-led research trials that where farmers are developing these trials and then bringing these experiments to people like me at universities. We're finding that when you bring livestock into cropping systems, whether it's corn and soybeans or tomatoes or whatever it is you're growing, if you grow cover crops in the shoulder seasons around, or rotate cover crops or forage crops in with whatever your cash crop is, you bring the livestock in to eat down the residue or to eat those cover crops, you actually improve the health of the soil dramatically. You do that much more quickly than if you were just knocking down the cover crops or just leaving the residues on the field. You're increasing the organic matter in the soil, you're increasing the fertility, you're reducing the need for chemical fertilizers. The livestock are doing a lot of the work that herbicides might be doing, or that you might rely upon herbicides to do for you in terms of controlling weeds. And so, again, this journal of discovery for me, what those experiences, what I heard from those farmers, and also from people like us who are eating the products of the land, that it's not dealing with this issue is not as simple as just giving up meat. In fact, that would be a mistake. We need to pay attention to the role that livestock play in ecosystems, and especially the role that they can actually help balance out the needs for chemical fertilizers and help us improve the soil and make farms more resilient for the future to deal with the sorts of types of weather variability that we're dealing with these days. So,
I want to. Oh, sorry.
no.
For the camera, we have to trade the microphone. So this has sort of been an entry level conversation. I've had Mark read some passages that I hope are informative or relevant to folks here. But this book is really deep. It's full of a lot of things, and not knowing your backgrounds, I would encourage you to just pick up a chapter and read it, because it's full of a lot of details that you may know and some that you may not.
Have any of you seen? There's a product line of crackers called Airly, and it's available at Walmart and a few other places. So it's a product line that was sourced from what what we call carbon negative grains. What that means is they were grains, oats and wheat, that had been grown in a way where they actually drew more carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil than was expended into the atmosphere through the other farming practices. So it was a net negative, which is a really good thing. Negative in this sense is positive. Okay. And so, my colleague Amy Swan and I, and Haley Summers, and a scientist from Spain worked together to source we worked with the early company to source these carbon negative grains, and these were from growers in South and North Dakota and parts of Minnesota. We'd been having really good success for about 2 years. We had a good logistical pipeline. We had enough grain being produced to source these crackers. And these were from growers that had been using regenerative farming techniques for more than a decade, some of them for more than 2 decades. So they had really built up the organic matter in the soil, and they had these very resilient farming systems. And then a really interesting thing happened in 2019, 2020. There's a drought that hit that region, and it hit it really hard 2 years in a row. It turns out that the only farmers who were actually able to deliver grains coming out of that region that were in the quantity and the quality that could be milled for crackers were coming off of some of these farms that we'd been sourcing for early crackers. The farmers who had been farming conventionally were really having a tough time because their soil didn't hold as much moisture um, as the farms that had been farmed regeneratively. And that's, I don't bring this up as to be necessarily an indictment of conventional farming, because people do what they do for a lot of different reasons. But the people who'd had the resources and the means and access to the funding and the technical resources, the support systems to actually pivot into these practices that had led to this resilience that was allowing them to withstand one of the deepest droughts that they'd ever experienced. I thought that was really interesting, and the early cracker brand was able to survive through that drought because of the resilience of those practices and those farmers.
Yeah, so we're trying to give you some fodder for conversation, which we're going to launch into after this one last comment. Um, I will also just say, when Mark brought this up, I was like, oh yeah, we all looked at buying that company or investing in them. Yeah, we actually looked at buying them in the company I work for now, because Mark is so humble. I just want to say that's the first time a very large company, who I guess I will not name, um, did a huge investment. I think it was, what, 3 years, that project? Massive investment into understanding the life cycle of their products, like from the farm up to the company, and then produced a brand that went on shelves. Um, the name is a little strange, and the packaging looked like a vacuum cleaner salesperson, so I had some problems. But the fundamental work behind it was really incredible. And again, Mark is right here at the middle of it. And when that company had approached us for investment, they were looking to exit out of the large corporation that had birthed them. And they said, well, I said, well, who did you work with on greenhouse gas accounting? And they said, oh, well, CSU. And Mark Easter. And I said, done. Like, let's talk. Let's have that conversation. Because I really have watched you over the years, and the integrity of how you show up is really wonderful. And I wanted to just read something from your book, which was my personal favorite passage, and why I think Mark and I are friends in addition to being colleagues. This is chapter 2, The Unnatural Green of Desert Vegetables. Oh, thank you. I was floating downstream through Cataract Canyon on the Colorado River, not in some gray rubber raft or sleek wooden dory, but in the river itself. It was my own vessel. I was my own vessel, suspended by a life jacket with only my head, floppy hat — I have seen you in this hat many times — and sandal-clad toed shoes poking above the surface. It was 105 degrees in the shade, but the water felt like a late summer swimming pool, the color of a red chili and chocolate sauce. The air smelled simply of river. The calls of the canyon wrens and spotted towhees stippled through the air, and the water burbled in a way that made me feel as if the river was completely satisfied with itself. I have no memory of the womb, but I wondered whether this was what it was like. Oops, we went too far. did you do this? So much dexterity. I got it, thanks. My companions and I had slipped from our comfortable rafts into the water while the rowers did some maintenance. Within the moments of having settled in, I lost track of where they were and where the rafts were, and for a while, where I was. If ever there was a time in my life for emptying the mind and immersing myself in the moment, this was it. And yet, my mind began to wander, a frustratingly distracted route through a series of topics that seemed like absurd scientific cones. I could not let them go. Eventually, my mind settled on the topic of lettuce. So, with that, I want to open it up to questions. I hope you all bring your biggest fears, biggest questions, technical acumen to Mark here, and we're just open for whatever discussion you might have. So, is there anybody in the audience who wants to ask Mark a question or something you want to discuss?
Did on those experiments with the crackers, did any of their neighbors figure it out after the drought?
So the question was, did any of the neighbors figure it out after the drought? And that's what we heard from the growers when we're doing sort of a post-mortem on how things were going. They typically get like a 40 to 50 bushel per acre yield in these areas, and they were getting 20 to 25 bushels. But the key thing was it was sufficient. The quality was good enough that it could be milled. Most of the growers, their neighbors, were getting similar yields or less, but the quality of the grain was not. They couldn't sell it.
For human consumption.
Yeah, for human. Yeah, it would go for animal feed and sell for half or 2/3 the price. Um, and they said that a lot of their neighbors were paying attention, and they were and they had networks that were forming around trying to support each other, through this whole process. And they wanted to get on board. They said, "How do we get on? How do we start to do this?" So it was unfortunately it takes it can take crises like this to lead to the sorts of actions that are necessary. But my heart goes out to those growers. They were in a really bad spot. Fortunately, they had crop insurance that was able to get them through those bad spots. But nobody wants to have to pull that lever. Yeah.
So, what I assess is happening in the Western Slope is that there are a lot of conventional farmers that cannot visualize the capital benefits of going to regenerative. In my opinion, it's a self-leaking ice cream cone. You spend a lot of capital up front, and then it continues to feed itself for 30 on years. So, like, um, I'm having trouble convincing uh, what I would assess to be conservative, uh, conventional farmers of transitioning to this, and I cannot really find ways to equate the dollar return on investment that they seem to be very focused on. What are your thoughts on how to communicate that to them?
So the question is, how do you communicate in a way? I think probably the most important thing is that the growers. So in my experience, the growers I work with, when I first meet them, they don't know me from Adam. I'm just some pointy-headed geek, coming from the university, you know, and the last thing that I'm going to do is try to preach to them about what they ought to be doing. Um, the the growers who make the transition typically see their neighbors succeeding in the transition, or they hear about somebody else, and so it's through the peer network.
Lead by example.
Yeah, exactly. So they see somebody else is succeeding. And it really comes down to the economics. But what we also find is that the transition out of conventional growing into regenerative or other sorts of practices, it can take several years. It takes funding. You have to you have to disrupt your farming system. If you're going to start growing cover crops, you have to find the right mix. You have to find a source of seed. You may have to get new planting equipment. You may have to get other implements like a roller crimper to help deal with it, or you may need to start bringing in livestock. Suddenly, you've got to pay for fencing to keep the livestock in your field if you didn't have fencing before. So there's all these things that come in to the play, and funding, and growers are busy enough. A lot of them are working a second job, or they have family members who are working second jobs, and so adding complexity into these systems can be a real challenge. But if funding is made available, and also technical assistance and connections to these peer networks, if growers can get through the first, we were just talking about this with Levi and Sonny earlier today, get through the first 5 to 7 years, the practices really seem to stick. Um, they, their costs reduce. They don't need as much fertilizer. Their demands for herbicide drop, and other farm chemicals. So the costs drop. It's not as complex anymore, and and they start to make more money. That's that's when things really start to stick. Now, that's kind of a rosy picture coming from somebody like me, the only thing I grow are tomatoes and beans in my backyard. I've got some apple trees, and so I'm not making my living doing this, but this is just observing um, growers making this transition. Um, it's hard work, it's backbreaking work, it's risky, and it's pretty scary. Um, and I think, I don't know, I'm surprised there aren't more Xanax salespersons in farm country trying to keep people from, going completely crazy trying to make these transitions. So,
Can I add something? I would just echo what Mark has said, and that the number one thing is like the peer learning. Just having somebody you can look over their fence and see what they're doing before you even ask them about it. If you have you're a champion in your community, just keep on doing that. People are going to learn from it, see how it goes. I just got back from Australia, as Mark mentioned, and I went there in part all the way around the world to see these two wheat farmers that are out in the wheat belt in Western Australia. And they have 60,000 hectares. How many acres is that?
almost 150,000.
150,000 acres. Half of that is just in what they call bush, right? They've like let the trees and bush grow back, and then the other half is in wheat production. And this is just sheer large scale. I mean, their tractor could not fit in this room. It's so big, wheat production. And they have two of those tractors, and they don't use any synthetic inputs. No phosphorus, zero. No nitrogen, zero. No chemicals. They have a crimper and they have sheep and they have Johnson Sioux bioreactors and they make a compost tea. And I think they have a lot of latent nitrogen in the soil because that soil has just got nitrogen piled on it from years of conventional farming. But they've been doing this now since 2017. And the bank is now giving them better loan rates than any of their neighbors because they consistently pay on time. And even during drought years, they are able to make all their payments because their production, while they're utilizing less of their land than their neighbors in production, their ability to produce even when it's a drought or when it's a flood, which Australia was in big drought and then it was in big flood, and their consistency. So the fact that like the third largest national bank in Australia is like, what are you doing? Because you make all your payments on time. And in Australia, they don't have crop insurance. So Mark mentioned earlier that those oat growers who weren't able to sell human grade oats into the market had to sell at a reduced price. Well, in Australia, you don't have crop insurance. Like, that's it. Like, you might have private insurance that you buy, but you're not getting a bailout, essentially. And so the market signal is just real strong. And I think, the first thing is a peer, someone to look at. People still think they're weird. They've been doing this since 2017. And they've shown it at, 150,000 hectares. And some of their neighbors are still like, yeah, you're just lying, like straight up. But what's interesting is that their youngest son is taking over their farming operations. He's 23, and his peer network is like, "What are you doing? What's going on over there?" So, it may take some watching, but those younger folks have been watching it. Any other questions for Mark? Yeah?
It's the whole topic of regenerative farming is really interesting, fascinating. But and I don't know whether the farms that you're talking about are pretty small farms, but how do you imagine this all these techniques would be scaled up somewhere like the United States? And maybe the example in Australia is illustrative or possible here, but there may be differences in Australia too that might prevent it from working here. But how do you see that scaling up to industrial size practices?
Did everybody hear that question? Yeah. Okay. Um, that's one of the things that makes me so hopeful about regenerative growing, is that so first of all, um, the decision to transition into regenerative practices, it happens one grower at a time, one field at a time. It's not something that generally happens. You don't have an entire county making a switch at a time. But when those transitions happen, as I was saying, if the growers can get through the first few years, then they tend to stick. And that's been going on for a while now. We see regenerative practices to varying degrees occurring on tens of millions of acres here in the United States today. And some people are all in and they're doing all of it, and some people are just doing one or two regenerative practices, but we see these practices already operating at scale. Um, and it's not just here in the US. Canada is way ahead of us, and parts of Europe as well, way ahead of us. Ukraine was way ahead of us until the war happened. Um, Parts of similar things happening in parts of South America as well too. So it's already happening at scale, and to help it be a climate solution, we really need it to scale even further, from tens of millions of acres into hundreds of millions of acres, and the potential is there. We just need um, we need the programs and we need the funding to support the growers, the initiative, and create the infrastructure that will aid in that transition.
So in other words, it's possible, but it has to be made to happen.
Right, exactly.
Uh, can I tag on to that? So one of the things that I've experienced is that the National Organic Standard and how USDA defines certified organic relative to conventional farming, there's a lot of what I would say somewhat unnecessary deconfliction requirements from a temporal standpoint. So you can't have, layman's terms, you can't put livestock in at the same time that you would ideally harvest, because that is the perfect time at small scale to have like chickens in there. From a large scale standpoint, I think the complexity, from my understanding, is like moving cattle that have always been raised in an organic status into transitioning farm land. And so I'm curious your thoughts around like what the sentiment is to define regenerative farming and then separate it from regenerative organic. Because in my opinion, organic is not really going after the same thing that regenerative would be.
So your question is about
Super convoluted, sorry.
that's okay. No, no, that's great. What you're wondering about is do you see? Are you asking, is the organic standard, is that potentially a model for developing a regenerative farming standard?
More of when is it going to actually be defined? I know I
Yeah.
went on a mission tour with Brian Reed this past summer, but like
Yeah.
I've understood that there is appetite at a USDA level, federal level, from a conservative standpoint as well, to adopt regenerative. What's your
Yeah.
understanding of that undercurrent or current?
I wish Steve Eula was here. Steve is a peach grower in Hotchkiss. Do any of you know Eula Family Farms? Yeah. And I feature Steve and his operation in a chapter on fruit in the book. And Steve and I were in a book event in Paonia 2 nights ago with Emily Sinclair at Paonia Books, and that was really fun. And this question came up. Steve, the reason I'm bringing up Steve is he's on the board of the National Organic Standards Commission, and um, and I I can't put words in his mouth, but I don't think it's likely at this juncture that USDA is going to be focused on developing a standard for regenerative. I think there are independent initiatives right now. There are 3 different labels that have emerged for regenerative farming, and they are independent labels. And it's sort of like bird-friendly coffee or something like that. It's an independent standard. If you want to put that label on your product, you have to work with the standard developer and make sure you get your operation inspected so that it meets the standard, and then they authorize you to put the label on it. That seems to have some legs right now, and I'm starting to see more of that in the grocery stores. And I think that's a good start. But I think it's probably going to take more growers investing in the community, and I suspect it's kind of like the National Organic Standard. It's going to need to be a grower-led. My sense is it's going to need to be a grower-led initiative because the growers are going to know what's possible, and I think they'll have a good idea, not only what's possible, but what's also marketable actually to the public. So that's
Yeah,
my 2 cents. I'm curious.
what's marketable is not obtainable by the NOS
Hmm.
in its current state,
Hmm.
in my opinion.
Okay.
Can I answer that?
Fair enough.
So I hear you, and I know you know a lot about the independent labels, and it takes a lot of time and money to get a third-party certification, whether that's a federal one or an independent one. Um, what we see in the market now is that consumers are very interested in the story of local and the story of their farmers. And so I've seen a lot of farmers be able to get premiums for growing regeneratively without any kind of a certification, but with a good story and real proof. Right? So that could be a number of different programs. They could have satellites, they could not. They could be signed up for a conservation plan with the NRCS. They could be ROC certified, or they could. We invested in a wheat mill in Washington State, and they have an organic line, and then they have what they call a conventional regenerative. And that conventional regenerative line of flour actually gets 20% above commodity market prices. The growers get that just by committing to doing certain practices to the company, and then the company tells their story. So I just would say that right now, at least in the marketplace, people want local, and they want to know the story of their farmers. And I think to keep that from getting greenwashed, it's important to have integrity and tell people how you're doing it, but maybe it's less important to have a definition. California, the state, just defined regenerative agriculture. I like to think that's in part because I left and stopped them from doing that for 10 years. And then, of course, they had to go and do it. I mean, not just me, Kevin here in the room. There's been a lot of people really trying to have a more nuanced conversation, because personally, what I don't want to see is this to become a boutique, expensive label. Right now, maybe like the Tesla market, we can sell high-priced things early on. Hopefully, we won't go that bad eventually, but we could have market penetration. And that's going to mean changing all of agriculture. And even as organic food consumption in the US has risen, organic acreage has not. Most of that's coming from Mexico and Canada, that organic food. So land transition, I think fundamentally is about making soil health just how we do agriculture. Or as Jeff Creek, who is also a mutual colleague of ours, says, putting the C back in the NPK, just make it how we farm. And in that sense, I'm not too worried about it. Yeah. Okay. We are gonna officially break this, but Mark and I are gonna hang out for a little bit. If you want to talk to anybody, also Kevin Watt, I'm gonna give a shout out to him in the back. He has worked a lot in this movement. Huge support with Tomcat Ranch and just supporting ranchers and growers across the United States in his work with both independently and with the Schmidt Family Foundation. So shout out to Kevin if you want to talk about his work back there.
And Danny and Jacob are going to be selling books over here, and I'd be happy to sign any books if you'd like. Um, thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, we're here to buy books. This is my 6th copy of this book because I keep giving it away.